1914. The great powers of Europe found themselves at the beginning of a war that by its end in 1918 nobody could have comprehended. Today I want to talk about World War I and the almost mythical Christmas truce. When war broke out, both sides were promised that it would be over quickly, that it would be over before Christmas. As the passionate and excited youths of both sides rushed to claim their place in history and piece of glory, the sound of their cheers for a short while drowned out the reality of industrial machines that, in that background, are now set in motion. And come the end of 1914, would become a constant, consuming and deafening crescendo to mark the beginning of industrial war. As both sides raced to the sea and dug in, it became clear that this war would not be over quickly. And by October, the High Command ultimately started to plan for a long, drawn-out stalemate conflict. But as December came, the junior officers of both sides began to send letters, offering terms to collect their dead and rebuild any fortifications over the winter. Now, many of these were not approved by High Command, but both sides of junior officers in the trenches realized that there was a need and a want of both sides wanting to have some sort of respite from what would ultimately become a very long and protracted war. As Christmas grew closer all across the Western Front, the fighting came to a near stop. Both sides began shouting insults at each other instead of exchanging rifle fire. These insults soon turned to jokes, and jokes soon turned to appeals at each other's humanity, such as "No brother wars" and "You're Anglo-Saxon, we're Saxon, we are the same." And these soon turned to singing. That night, on the night of December 24th, 1914, on the Western Front, soft singing began to be heard through the cold, barbed wire of no man's land. The Germans sung "Silent Night," and in that silent night was the response of the English singing that same song back. In unison, both sides of the trenches put down their arms, picked up their spirits, and sang to each other. A night shared, and one, I'm sure, was as warm as any night on that cold front could ever feel. The next morning, a heavy fog beset on the Western Front. That fog provided cover and allowed both sides to begin to collect their dead. But as the morning rose and the fog cleared, both sides were left standing. In the middle of their tasks, they looked at each other in the middle of no man's land. No side was armed, tasks half completed. In this moment, without saying a word, both sides approached each other and in humanity and trust shook hands. Troops on both sides met. Officers alike, they traded gifts, food, helmets, they cut each other's hair, and even had a game of football. On that beautiful winter's day, as the light snow fell, it was a moment that maybe, even for a brief time, the war was over by Christmas. While all of this transpired, it was in this moment that a German soldier who was studying to be a pastor gathered men from both sides to read Psalms 23. "The Lord is my shepherd. One shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the shadow of the valley of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. While all of this transpired, I'm sure for those men, this was a moment that they realized, did any of them have to really be there? Were they different after all? A British officer, Murdoch M., who later in British Parliament would recount, the fact is that we did it. And I then came to the conclusion that I have held very firmly ever since, that if it had been left to ourselves there in no man's land, we would never have fired another shot, and the war would have been over that day. A historian, Mordis Ecclestone, says, the Christmas Truce, is the last expression of that 19th century world of manners and morals, where the opponent was a gentleman. As the war goes on, the enemy becomes increasingly abstract. You don't exchange courtesies with an extraction. The industrialization of warfare after 1914 changed the world forever, and it changed how we view each other. Do these accounts then not show us that if it was up to our fellow man after all, we wouldn't be there? We wouldn't be there on the front line. After all, it was the high brass that told the officers that there should not be a truce. Does this then show us that when it comes to our fellow man, those of us meeting in the trenches together, those of us doing the fighting, that have families and homes, those that are not disconnected, those who want peace, that are not powered by money, greed, and power, it is us that we want is peace. And it is those behind us, miles away, on silver platters, those are the ones that have us here, by the barrel of a gun forced to be here, to be held against someone that is no different than you or I, because they themselves are not here. It is you that does not want this outcome to begin with, and we are forced to march over the top through machine gun fire. As Murdoch continues to talk as if it was down to the men in the trenches, the war would have been over by Christmas, as those powers promised to propagate all of us into these trenches that we had dug. It makes one think that if the war did end on that Christmas day, Germany would not have lost. There would have been no Russian Revolution, no Treaty of Versailles, no rise of Germany, no millions or countless dead, no Cold War. One has to ask themselves, if it was down to the man in the trench shaking the hand with another, that maybe we could avoid these altogether. Now, these accounts and opinions of those during the Christmas truce are extremely important. But 'twas not ever thus, as there was those in command that believed that it was ungentlemanly, that these remarks of peace and acceptance and understanding, there was no place for them in war. And maybe you feel the same way. But if you do feel that there's no place for middle ground or peace or meeting with one's humanity, there were those that spoke about this. There was one young man that said that the Christmas truce was insulting to his nation and a disgusting show of peace. That one individual, a Lance Corporal Adolf Hitler. On the Allies side, a Captain Billy Congreve thinks that all truces should not have been so. And happening when the Germans approached his trench and his line, he ordered his troops to open fire. That is not gentlemanly and not British. However, it was mostly between the British and the Germans that we see these accounts of peace, as on the Belgian and French lines, there were no such accounts of this happening. So one has to ask himself, why? One reason I've thought about is the British were not on British soil, the Germans were not on British soil, whereas the French and Belgians were fighting for their home. Maybe that had something to do with the questioning of why they were there by the British and the Germans, but not so much between the French and the Belgians. Things like this, one does have to consider. But is the land that we fight on really an excuse to abandon our humanity? So why are we reviewing the Christmas truce of 1914? An era long gone that by 1918 the industrialization of the world of warfare and the fall of those monarchies ultimately changed our world forever. Can we go back to an era of gentlemanly warfare? Here on this channel, as you all know, we cover the skills to allow capable men and women to be moral protectors. So looking back on the lessons of history, let us not forget that we can easily be told that our enemy is across a trench, but when we come together in something common, look each other in the eye, shake each other's hands, we can have moments of humanity. It's down to us as humans to recognize what true evil is and what being told to hate one another is. Merry Christmas to you all. As always, look after your mates, look after each other, and I'll see you on the next one.